Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Power. I'm head of the Social Sciences Division here at the university, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel on democratic backsliding at Meeting Minds Weekend. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Esme Wilkes and also Nick Stone-Villani, who from the divisional office who helped to organize this, as well as our two speakers who have traveled long distances to be with us here today. We're fortunate to be able to hear from four distinguished scholars and practitioners. In the interest of time, I'm going to have to give them much shorter introductions than they would normally deserve. But before that, let me just explain how our session will work in terms of timing. This is a big topic. Unfortunately, we have only 60 minutes for the primary session. I know that many of you have other events consecutive events that you're booked onto. We have this room until 2. We will have presentations until 1:30. At 1:30, I will stop the proceedings for a moment for anyone who needs to depart, and then we will continue with Q&A with our speakers until 2 o'clock, if that's okay with people. I know this is over lunchtime, and we're also competing with a glorious September day in Oxford as well. So now to the substance of our panel, I think the importance of which is self-evident to anyone observing global affairs. Democratic backsliding, by definition, is something that happens to democracies, actually. And contrary to what many scholars and commentators believed 20 or 30 years ago, it's not a phenomenon that's restricted to new democracies. It also increasingly affects old democracies as well, including my home country, which is the United States. And this is why we've invited a mix of speakers with expertise in both established democracies and transitional democracies. The ways in which this phenomenon manifests itself are probably too varied to be summarized neatly, and we could very easily have a separate panel on any one of them, actually. Populism, disinformation, polarization, electoral denialism, an American favorite, an erosion of civil and political liberties. Each of our speakers will approach the phenomenon in a different way, and I will not foreshadow what they're going to tell you. But it's my privilege now to introduce them in the order that they will speak. Heather Grabbe is an Oxford alumna who read PPE here at the university. She's a senior advisor to the Open Society Foundations based in Brussels. Heather is a political scientist and advocate for democratic pluralism and open societies. She's worked previously at Chatham House at the Center for European Reform and as a senior advisor to the Commission. And many of you will recognize her as a distinguished commentator on European Union and global affairs. Welcome back to Oxford, Heather. Kevin Casas-Zamora, next to me, is a DPhil alumnus of my college, St. Anthony's. He's also a political scientist and a practitioner. In his native Costa Rica, he served as Minister of Planning, as Vice President of the Republic. He's also been Undersecretary for Political Affairs at the Organization of American States, and he currently leads the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, or International IDEA by its acronym, based in Stockholm. I've met with him in various cities around the world. I don't think I've ever actually met you here, but welcome back to Oxford. Now to my two colleagues from the Social Sciences Division. Professor Kate O'Regan, also next to me, is now the inaugural director of the Bonavero Institute for Human Rights, which is a unit of the law faculty in the Social Sciences Division here at the university. Previously, she had a distinguished career in South Africa. In the 1980s, she practiced as a lawyer in Johannesburg in a variety of fields. And in 1994, she was appointed to the newly formed Constitutional Court of South Africa by President Mandela. Since joining Oxford, she's been a major driver of our university's agenda in the area of human rights and transitional justice. Our final speaker will be Professor Petra Schleiter, who works closely with me as she's the co-head of our Department of Politics and International Relations. She's a fellow of St. Hilda's College, and she's a specialist in the institutional design of democracy, on party competition, and on voter attitudes and behavior. And Petra will tell you a little bit about our efforts here in the university to develop a forthcoming center on democratic resilience, which is a way to try to assist democracies against backsliding. So without further ado, and keeping an eye on our limited time, I'm going to turn the floor over to Heather Grabbe and welcome her back to Oxford. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to see you all. It seems such a shame on such a beautiful afternoon to sit in the dark talking about the dark side of democracy and everything that's going wrong. But I think we'll have a number of perspectives based on a great deal of research, data-driven and also theoretical, to help us. So I'm going to talk about two very particular aspects of the push against, in particular, liberal democracy in Europe. over the past, say, 12 years. I would kind of put it at that. And to talk about particularly the impact of new forms of contestation of liberal democracy on two particularly important parts of democratic governance. One is on institutions, and the other one is on international cooperation and the way that liberal democracies deal with one another. So I'm just going to talk about one particular phenomenon in the pushback, or what you might call democratic backsliding. There are lots of definitional terms we could debate here. But I want to talk about populism, in particular radical right populism, which I would define using Casas-Zamora, the Dutch political scientist's term. He calls it populism it's a thin-centered ideology. Thin-centered because it doesn't really have that much of an ideology of its own. It's a rather amorphous ideology which can latch onto one issue or another, which essentially posits the claim that the problem with democracies is that the elites don't represent the people, and that there needs to be some kind of leader, usually a strong man, but sometimes a woman, who represents the will of the people, and particularly the will of the majority and the native people of the soil, however that's defined, and that the will of the people should be expressed absolutely, because that is the legitimate grounds of politics. So it's essentially an anti-elitist claim, which it's based on, and then that claim, and then the ideology can move around many different things. Migration is a typical one, because that can be claimed to be an elite conspiracy against the will of the people, and so on, and it's a great way of othering a particular group. And of course, now we're seeing a lot of populism which is moving on to the issue of climate and against climate action, what you might call a green wedge in populism. And populism is always there in democracy. There's a British political scientist, Margaret Cameron, who calls it the dark side of democracy. It's always there on the margins. But in the past dozen years, what we've seen is in a number of European countries, populism moving much more into the center and even into power. So I think we could argue that Fidesz, the ruling party in Hungary since 2010, is a radical right populist party. Also PiS in Poland, the Law and Justice Party, could argue also that Giorgia Meloni, the now Prime Minister of Italy, the Fratelli d'Italia, is also a radical right populist party. And that's the difference. The difference is that these are parties that have moved from being on the fringes, and some have stayed on the fringes, for example, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, but they've actually come into power, and therefore affecting very much also other parties, particularly parties of the centre-right. Now, why is this important? There are many reasons. I'm just going to focus on two, the question of institutions and the question of international cooperation. So in terms of institutions, the reason why radical right populism based on this thin-centred ideology is important is because even when they get into power, these parties claim that institutions are not working in the interests of the people. They're not expressing the will of the people very often. Very often they make this claim when, of course, those institutions oppose their own power. Now, which is, if you think about a classic democratic setup where you have separation of powers between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, typically, a party in Europe is able both to take the executive and sometimes the legislature as well. That definitely happened in Hungary. It hasn't happened in Poland, where the opposition is still strong in the legislature. But the branch of government which populist parties particularly like to attack is, of course, the judiciary, because judges in Europe are typically not elected, unlike in the United States, where they can be claimed to be partisan, and we're now seeing an extraordinary politicization of the judiciary in the United States. That's much less often the case in Europe, because our judges are usually appointed rather than elected. But of course, one of the classic things that radical right populist parties do when they get into power is to try and take over the appointment of judges through the Judicial Council. And we see this as the huge political battle that's been going on in Poland in the last years while PiS has been in power. And it's also, Fidesz was much more successful, much more quickly in doing this. And of course, you may remember that in Italy, under the Berlusconi government in the 1990s, there was a battle royal between Berlusconi and the judges. So the judiciary is often presented as not working with the will of the people. And there's usually a big fight. So if you see a fight going on between between the judiciary and the executive, there's usually some populism involved. I would say it's quite a good benchmark of what's happening. It means that an executive is very uncomfortable with the judiciary saying what you're doing is against the law, and the contestation is there. Now, the danger with that is that it can, over time, erode public confidence in the judiciary. And you may hear, I mean, in this country, in Britain, you often hear, these are unelected judges. It's Parliament that should decide, i.e. the legislature. It's not judges who should decide these issues. But there are good reasons not to elect judges. There are good reasons for them not to be partisan. We've seen many examples of this in the United States, especially when they're trying to decide, for example, election outcomes. But this question of who do they work for? Are the judges working in the public interest? Is at the heart of the populist contestation. So, and over time, if public confidence in the judiciary is eroded, of course there can definitely be corruption in the judiciary, there might be good reasons for judicial reform, but the battle between executive and judiciary can be quite deleterious to both institutions over time if it's primarily a grounds of contestation of the ruling party, which is basically arguing that the will of the people is more important than the law, because then that starts to undermine rule of law. So that takes me on to the second key point about this kind of populism in particular, and the way it affects international cooperation. Because given that this kind of thin-centered populism is basically saying elites are not working in the interests of the people, and elites need to do that. When elites go and meet other elites and negotiate with them in other countries, this is framed usually as some kind of betrayal. This is some kind of treachery. And so often you get criticism of international institutions like the IMF, the World Bank. There can be very legitimate reasons for criticizing all of these institutions. But the populist claim is typically that our elites are going there to negotiate with that other country's elites, and that must be by definition not presenting the will of the people. And that can then undermine collective action at international level on very important collective problems. And I think climate is the area where there are actually very few international institutions which are effective on climate. They tend to work through unanimity. It's very hard to overcome collective action problems. And so the kind of populism that criticizes international cooperation is particularly dangerous at this point in time when there's an urgent need for cross-national, multinational action on climate. It's really important. And all of this, both the institutional implications and the implications for international institutions, bring a double whammy to the European Union, to European integration. And this is why radical right populism threatens European integration as nothing else has ever done. I think it's far more dangerous than Brexit or indeed any other form of withdrawal from the EU, because what it does is to erode the European Union from the inside. Before Brexit, back in 2014-15, there was a lot of talk in other countries about the idea of leaving. So Marine Le Pen talked about Frexit, or certainly of France leaving the euro. That was one of her election campaigns. We saw some talk in Hungary about Huxit, and in Poland about Polexit, from PiS and from Fidesz respectively. That all disappeared in recent years, as the real consequences of Brexit became clear. There is no more talk about leaving the European Union, but there is still a great deal of contesting of the European Union and of collective decisions that are taken there. Now, why does this matter? It's always there. You're always going to have Euroscepticism. You're always going to have opposition. The heart of democracy is debate, and therefore contestation is at the heart of democracy. It's, what's to worry about? That's what the European Parliament is for. That's what the European Council is before, where elected politicians, directly elected politicians from many countries can get together and debate issues. Well, the reason why radical right populism is particularly dangerous for the European Union is that, in the end, the European Union is a giant compromise machine between elites. The European Council is filled with the heads of state and government. The European Parliament is filled with members of the European Parliament, directly elected. But these are elites that go to Brussels to negotiate with one another. So it's quite easy for a populist who opposes the outcomes to say, well, you see, they're betraying the will of the people. They're betraying the national interest. And especially because the EU is a community of law that rests on institutions. So if you're an anti-institution party that thinks that judges are by definition not working in the interests of the people, and that elites are not doing so, then the EU as a community of law has no legitimacy for you at all, because you've got the Court of Justice in Luxembourg, the Court of Justice of the European Union, which has international judges. Yes, they're from every member state, but they are definitely not elected. And even the elected representatives are negotiating with one another. And that means that parties like Fidesz and PiS, even though they are in power, therefore, they are in charge of national institutions, and they are the ministers in the council. They are the prime ministers in the European Council. They have many MEPs in the parliament. They portray the outcome of many decisions at EU level in which they fully participated as not being in the interests of their people, and then they refuse to implement them. And this is why it really matters, because the EU as a community of law relies on what's called in the Treaty on European Union on sincere cooperation. It relies on most member states implementing and enforcing the laws in their own national jurisdictions, because the Court of Justice of the EU has only got a tiny amount of administrative capacity if you think about the size of the union and the acquis communautaire, the body of law. And essentially the whole system rests on the idea of national enforcement of compliance. So when, for example, PiS contests the outcome of court decisions around chopping down the forest in Poland, or Fidesz contests the outcome of a European court judgment about academic freedom and manages to close down the Central European University and force it to leave the country, there's a problem that the EU doesn't really have any comeback. So this undermining of the community of law is a very significant outcome, and it's much more difficult. The EU doesn't really have remedies of the kind that you would find at national level in other parties being able to come in and take over. It undermines the functioning of the EU as a community of law as well as its values. I'll finish there.
Thank you so much, Heather. Thank you. Thank you again, Heather. And we'll now turn to our second speaker, Kevin Casas-Zamora from International IDEA. Over to you, Kevin. Thanks, and welcome back to Oxford.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you, everybody, for being here and for showing that you care about democracy despite the good weather outside. Well, let me start by saying that it's wonderful to be home, because this is a special place for me. And as I was making my way to this meeting, I was thinking that neither this building nor this event were around when I was here. And it was not that long ago, by the way. So it's wonderful to see that Oxford remains as wedded to tradition as always, but it has become a more vibrant place and more youthful, for lack of a better word, place. So thank you for the invitation. Look, let me start with the punchline. The punchline here is that democratic trends are not good globally, but they also need to be unpacked, and this is important. And let me give you a couple of factoids. One of the things that we do at International IDEA, and I can tell you more about International IDEA in the Q&A if you want, but one of the things we do is we have a rather strong work stream for several years now, monitoring and measuring the performance of democracies globally. And we put out a report, which we publish every year, on the global state of democracy. And we're about to issue the next iteration of the report. It will come out in early November. And it makes for sobering reading. For the 6th year in a row, more countries have shown net declines in their democratic performance than advances. And how do we know this? Well, I mean, I won't bore you with the details, but we have a fairly comprehensive conceptual framework to measure the performance of democracies that breaks down the concept of democracy into 22 attributes. So when countries show more advances, show more attributes that advance than attributes that decline, we say that the country is advancing in its democratic performance. Well, for the 6th year in a row, there are more countries that are regressing in terms of the number of attributes of their democratic performance that is declining than countries that are advancing. And this is the longest sequence that we observe since 1975, which is when our data starts. Not just that, we use a concept of democratic erosion whereby a democracy is eroding when one of those 22 attributes, and it might be in one country the protection of civic space, in a different country it might be the ability to hold credible elections, what have you. When one of those 22 attributes declines in a statistically significant way over a period of 5 years, we say that that democracy is eroding. Back in 2012, democracy erosion, so defined, was affecting 12% of democracies. That proportion has exploded to 50% right now. So that alone tells you where the wind is blowing. Now, in the upcoming report, we group those 22 attributes into 4 big categories. Namely, representation, where things like the ability to hold credible elections and the ability of legislatures to check on executive power are to be found. Rule of law, rights, the protection of different kinds of rights, and participation. 4 big categories of attributes. And what we see, roughly speaking, is the following. We found this year very clear declines when it comes to representation, in terms of the ability of countries to hold credible elections and having effective legislatures, and this is across the board in all regions. When it comes to the rule of law, we see declines when it comes to judicial independence and the question of the protection of personal security. Interestingly enough, when it comes to the rule of law, for the first time in a long time, we see advances when it comes to corruption. And this is significant. In a number of places, the scores for corruption are improving in a visible way. But generally speaking, the picture for the rule of law is not a good one. When it comes to rights, for the most part, we see a stagnation, in many cases at a low level. Many countries continue to experience declines when it comes to freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, and once again, deteriorations when it comes to personal safety. And the most interesting bit is that the one silver lining that we are noticing when it comes to the performance of democracy comes in the shape of participation. Participation levels seem to be improving in a good swath of the world, particularly in younger democracies. What do we mean by participation? What we measure there is not simply electoral participation, is also civic engagement. The willingness of people to participate in around causes, demanding things, holding politicians to account beyond elections. So that side of democracy appears to be the most vigorous of all by far. And we've been seeing this for a number of years. All in all, despite the green offshoots here and there, the picture is gloomy. Now, the question is why? And this is, of course, not an easy question to answer. After thinking a lot about this, I've settled on 2 or 3 groups of factors as to why this is happening. The first factor is what I would call the disappearing democratic polis. It seems to me that increasingly democratic communities don't have a set of common values and experiences to hold them together. Democracies are being rent asunder by different forces and are growing weaker to withstand the authoritarian assault. And here, we have to acknowledge that we're seeing growing levels of polarization pretty much everywhere. And when you talk about polarization, inevitably you have to talk about the role that social media is playing into all of this, and disinformation and misinformation campaigns and all of that. But this is not the only centrifugal force. I mean, you obviously have grotesque levels of inequality that are weakening democracies everywhere. So you have very strong centrifugal forces that are pulling democratic communities apart. And at the same time, the instruments to aggregate preferences and interests are in a shambles, particularly political parties. They were supposed to play that role of aggregating preferences and interests, and they are in a shambles. I mean, just to give you one factoid, if you take the World Values Survey, which is a very interesting survey covering almost 80 countries around the world on political attitudes, only 4% of people say that they have a great deal of confidence in political parties. The fools, right? 4%. That tells you the gravity of this weakening of the instruments to aggregate interest in democratic communities. So that's a first group of factors. Then you have a second and more complex group of factors, which is what I would call the loss of faith in democratic institutions, generally linked. I mean, this comes in different shapes. I mean, there's a first phenomenon, which is the perceived inability of democracies to respond to social demands. And here, this is a very complicated thing that is less obvious than people make it out to be. It's true that social demands are growing exponentially, while the ability of democracy to cater to those demands is growing very slowly, if at all. That is true. At the same time, I have to say, to me, the experience of the pandemic has been a very interesting one. Because I get the sense, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A, I get the sense that, when you look at the performance of democracies, generally speaking, and I'm painting here with a very, very broad brush, when you look at the performance of democracies during the pandemic, it looks much better now than it did 3 years ago. Whereas the performance of highly authoritarian systems when it comes to the pandemic looks much worse now than it did 3 years ago. And there are very strong reasons for that. I mean, one is a fundamental trait of democracy is its capacity to self-correct. So I think that played a very important role during the pandemic. But generally speaking, there's the perception that democracies are proving very slow to solve problems, to respond to crisis. But there's also, in this loss of faith in democratic institutions, there's a factor that needs to be underscored very significantly, and is corruption, and the perception of corruption, that is having a toxic effect in this story. And this is something that we that operate globally, we see everybody. I mean, Open Societies, the OSF has just published a report, the Barometer, that covers political attitude towards democracy in 30 countries. And one of the big findings is that in those 30 countries that cover about 5 billion people, the single most important problem that people identify in their countries is corruption. So this is a really, really big factor. And then there's a third set of factors in this story of the severe headwinds that democracy is facing, which is the dramatic change that the international environment has undergone. I mean, my strong impression is that the international environment has become much less conducive to protecting democracy. And this is, again, a complex story. It features the long list of own goals that democratic powers have scored over the past couple of decades, starting with the invasion of Iraq, with the huge financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 and its aftermath, the nightmarish experience with Donald Trump. I mean, all those things have weakened the attraction of the liberal democratic model globally. At the same time, in a way that was not the case a generation ago, you're seeing the very clear emergence of competitors in terms of models of governance that are being perceived as credible and successful. So, and one of the effects of this is that authoritarian or would-be authoritarian leaders pay less of a price for their democratic transgressions nowadays. So in a way, you know, what we're seeing here, I mean, this is my diagnosis, and we can have a long conversation about that. My diagnosis is that the disappearing democratic polis and the loss of faith in democratic institutions due to domestic but also international factors have weakened democracy, have made people more willing to give up on democratic systems, and when they do, the autocrats that emerge pay less of a price for their transgressions. This is the summary of my story. But one overarching conclusion that stems from this diagnosis is that, yes, democracy faces a global long-term struggle against powerful competitors, but more fundamentally, it faces a struggle against itself. It needs to be redesigned, reinvented for our time. And this is very important. Now, what is to be done? Which is the crucial question. Well, I'll just, since I'm running out of time, or have already, I'll just mention a few things. Well, first of all, we need to take this with the urgency it deserves. And that urgency, with a sense of urgency and a sense of humility. And here I go back to something that Tim mentioned, which is very important, which is that the problems of democracy are global in nature and therefore call for a global response, because this is affecting young democracies, old democracies, industrialized democracies, emerging democracies, the lot. I mean, that old trope that, these issues were only issues for young and poor democracies is no longer true. I mean, you just have to open the pages of a newspaper in the US or in very proud members of the European Union to see that this ailment of democracy has gone global. So this we have to take with a sense of urgency and a sense of humility. And the task here is to create a network, a global network to protect democracy, a global network that goes beyond governments, by the way. And this is one of the reasons why, despite the skepticism and the shortcomings of the process and all of that, I do think that there's value in the Summit for Democracy process organized and convened by the Biden administration. I think is a venue that is worth preserving, to have a global conversation about the state of democracy and what to do about it. Number two, we need better analytical tools. We need better analytical instruments, because what has happened with democratic setbacks is somewhat similar to what has happened with war. War used to be very clear-cut. Either you were at war or not. Well, not anymore. A democratic breakdown used to be very simple to spot, not anymore. Now the erosion of democracy comes in all sorts of shades of gray that render the threat much more difficult to identify and to counter. Number three, we need to put the quality of democratic governance at the center of political agendas. I mean, we really need to put at the center of political agendas the question of good institutional design so that democracy is more efficacious in dealing with social demands. We need to put at the heart of political agendas the question of fiscal pacts to sustain fiscal robustness and to give governments, states, the firepower to respond to social demands. We need to talk in a very serious way about ways to improve the quality of public administration, and we need to talk about good practices to strengthen citizen trust in institutions. And inevitably, if we talk about trust, we need to talk about the pandemic of corruption. And finally, we need to, and this is vital, we need to take very seriously and protect the role of countervailing institutions. I mean, the institutions that are meant to check on the exercise of executive power. The likes of courts, the likes of electoral authorities, the likes of human rights commissioners, the likes of ombudspersons, because one of the things that you see in all cases of democratic backsliding is a deliberate attempt to weaken those institutions, which, by the way, include the free press. So this has to be the center of the defensive battle that we need to wage. So, yeah. So the punchline, I mean, I'll finish here, just saying that I guess this is, yeah, you know, to some extent is a geopolitical struggle, but not so much as some people want to depict it. I mean, this is largely an internal struggle for democracies in which our task is to make democracy live up to its promise. That's the crucible we face. And the struggle to save democracy globally will not be won by generals or by spies. It will be won by political scientists, by public administrators, by sociologists, by economists. And this may sound less glamorous than a titanic geopolitical fight, but it's every bit as complicated and as demanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much, Kevin. We'll now turn it over to Professor Kate Regan.
Thanks very much, Tim, and thanks very much to the audience for being here and for being invited to this interesting conversation. I thought I'd start by just saying a little bit about the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights, which is a relatively new and quite small research centre in the Faculty of Law in Oxford. We're based at Mansfield College. We adopt a very broad understanding of human rights to include democracy and the rule of law, and we have a particular interest in understudied areas outside North America and Western Europe. We also focus on linking practice and scholarship, so a lot of the conversation that we're having today is at the core of the kind of work we do at the Bonavero. There are a range of scholars working on different aspects of human rights and democracy, and many with a particular interest in the pathology of modern democracies. So turning then to talk a little bit about democratic backsliding, as the previous speakers have said, this is a phenomenon that's happening across the globe. There are a range of major indices, including the one that Kevin mentioned, the International IDEA State of Democracy report, all of which show that we're seeing and have been seeing, probably for the last decade and a half, patterns of democratic decay. So whether you look at VDEM's Democracy in the World report in 2022, it said that in the aftermath of the Berlin Wall, the gains that democracy gained at that stage have largely been lost by 2022. Freedom in the World's index in 2022 said it was the 17th year in a row in which we'd seen democratic decline. Although interestingly, and somewhat in contrast to International IDEA and VDEM, and I'll be interested in Kevin's comments on this, they suggest that in 2022 we saw the smallest gap between the countries that were declining and the countries that were improving that they had noticed in those 17 years. And they wondered whether cautiously the recession in democracy may be bottoming out. As somebody who does anything other than read the data, I think that might be an optimistic view, but it'll be interesting to hear what Kevin thinks about that. So again, as Kevin has pointed out, one of the problems with backsliding, recession, decay, however you describe this phenomenon, a little bit like Tolstoy's unhappy families, they all come in different modes and phases. And one of the challenges for scholars is to start trying to create a typology of the patterns of decay that we're seeing. They are not all alike. Philip Dann at the Humboldt School has used a very arresting metaphor to describe, to provide a typology of populist leaders into punks and nerds. And punks, he says, and you can all be guessing in your mind who the punks of the populist world are. Punks are people who are attention seekers. They often don't have a very long-term project. They tend to fix on kind of high-profile projects. And his classic example of the punk populist leaders are Donald Trump and Bolsonaro. So think, for example, of both of them with their very self-centered, very kind of attention-grabbing way of political leadership. The focus, for example, on Build the Wall, which seemed to be much more an ideological project than one of bricks and mortar. And similarly with Bolsonaro's denial of climate, enthusiasm for deforestation, kind of somewhat non-consistent projects, just big high-profile ones. Nerds, on the other hand, are much less high-profile. Very often they're more, they look much more like an ordinary political leader. But what Philip Dann says is they tend to have very coherent policies, often aimed at undermining democratic structures, and often aimed at very careful, thought-through ways of white-anting democracy from within. And again, you're probably all thinking, well, so who are the nerds of current populist leaders around the world? And the example that Dan gives would be Prime Minister Modi in India, who he would say, there's a very clear project here. It's a Hindutva project. It's a project about Hindu nationalism. It's gone with a whole lot of very detailed, comprehensive undermining of the Indian constitution. My former colleague and head of research at the Bonavero Institute wrote one of the leading papers on this called Killing a Constitution by 1,000 Cuts. The great detail that underpins Modi's India is a classic nerdish approach to populist leadership. And within that, I think Dan would also include Fidesz, who started out with a process of constitutional reform. Almost the first thing that Orban did was to replace the Hungarian constitution in 2011, effectively replace a constitutional court, which had played a very distinct and powerful role in the early years of the Hungarian post-Berlin Wall republic. And so you see these patterns. Stephen Gardbaum has developed a similar binary typology to that of Dan with a slightly less eye-catching metaphor, but he talks about populist politics versus political populism versus structural populism. And it largely maps onto this idea that you're getting some populist leaders who are very much about themselves. They often don't have much in the way of a succession plan, populist leaders, versus the structural populists who are often embedded. They may have, in fact, taken over political parties, but they're often embedded in political parties, and it's a much longer term project. Now, of course, these are both really ideal types, and actual real-world examples might at times fall within them. But they are, this distinction, I think, is important for the kind of work we're doing at the Bonavero Institute, where we're trying to think about what are the bullocks, what are the safeguards that one could write into constitutional democracies, whether as a matter of constitutional design, as a matter of legislative amendment, or as a matter of political practice, to protect against democratic decay. Because democracies are, of course, and both the previous speakers have commented on this, they're meant to be vehicles to cope with enormous amounts of political disagreement. That is the project. And sometimes it's quite difficult to distinguish between attacks on a democracy and its structures and just a difference of political view. And I think that as scholars and working in the field, this is something that we need to look at more closely. I think the first distinction is to look for this pattern of undermining of the overall constitutional structures. That can be, of course, the actual constitutional text in those countries where there is one. But even in a democracy such as Britain's, where you don't have one dominant constitutional text, there are a range of rules, practices, norms, conventions which make up the British Constitution and which can be varied over time. One of the remarkable things about the British Constitution is how quickly it can be changed. Just look at the Blair project of the 2000s in terms of changing the character of the senior court in the United Kingdom, from the House of Lords to the Supreme Court, the process of devolution of power to Scotland and to Ireland, the adoption of the Human Rights Act. All of these were enormously significant changes to the British Constitution, effectively adopted by one government. And similarly, I would argue, and I think that Petra may turn to this, we're seeing similar attempts at changing, or successful attempts at changing, the British Constitution over the last decade under the Conservative government. So one always has to be saying to oneself, is this a change which is a legitimate change around policy differences upon which we legitimately disagree and we recognize that our democracy needs to accommodate? Or is this in fact a change which is undermining the project of democracy itself? And I think it's very difficult to determine. So the common modes of attack on constitutional democracy are attacks on free and fair elections. And again, these can take very dramatic forms. We will no longer have elections. Or they can be, for example, we're seeing an example in the Caribbean at the moment, we will no longer have local government elections. We're going to appoint local government. Is that a fundamental attack on democracy? Quite arguably it is. Then you can have forms, for example, requiring people to bring IDs, as recently happened in the United Kingdom. Is this an attack on free and fair elections, or is it an attempt, in fact, to shore up free and fair elections? Often, these interventions can be argued both ways. Similarly, attacks on political and civil rights, attacks on media freedoms, on journalists are very common part of the pattern of democratic undermining that goes on. And crucially, attacks on checks and balances. And in a sense, this is the corollary to Kevin's comment that one of the things we need to do to protect democracy is to ensure that we don't end up with concentrated power, that we do have a system of checks and balances. And it is very interesting to me, perhaps it's my judicial background, but it is interesting to me how often the initial worrying attacks are on the independence of the judiciary. They don't necessarily need to be a very direct one. So what they can do, as for example, PiS did in Poland, is change the retirement age. Another thing that can happen is you can change the pension rules around the judiciary. You can, of course, and this is always the classic one, change the mode of appointment of the judiciary. But again, it's the question that we always have to face when we're watching these things is this time to put up a red flag? Or is this, in fact, a legitimate process of institutional improvement and adjustment? Other attacks, and I think these are often real red flags, are attacks on civil society, attacks on modes of funding of civil society. That's been a classic model in Modi's India, denying the right of civil society to seek funding for their activities, banning organizations of civil society. And sometimes we see this happening to the media, of course. One of the things we're seeing under the modern democratic decay is attacks on media are less often closing media outlets down. There are often attacks on journalists, making journalists fearful. but they're often through the mode of the market, purchasing media outlets, making sure that media outlets only speak with one voice in a society just through the market. So these are all the kind of techniques of democratic decay that we're seeing, and they're much harder to call out than a coup d'etat, and they need to be looked at very closely. Finally, of course, we see attacks on universities. That's happened in Fidesz's Hungary. You see it happening in India. It is a worrying pattern. Is attacks on universities, which often goes hand in hand with attacks on the concept of expertise. And we've seen that through COVID, we've seen it through vaccinations, but we see it in a whole range of other ways in the world as well. So the range of questions that comparative constitutional lawyers and comparative human rights lawyers seek to ask are, what are the methods of democratic decay? How can we distinguish attacks on the system from legitimate remodeling of a system? What can be done to safeguard democracy? Can constitutional design help? And what is the role of independent institutions such as courts and guarantor bodies such as electoral commissions, human rights commissions, and ombuds in protecting against decay? Because we're running out of time, I'm not going to go into those in any greater detail, but we're very happy to answer questions in Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Kate. Our final speaker will be Petra Schleiter, and then we will take a short break at 1:30 to allow anyone who needs to depart the meeting. We'll continue with Q&A until 2 o'clock for those of you who can remain.
Thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you.
I've actually got some slides for you, and I'll talk not just about democratic backsliding, but also about resilience and the kind of work that we're doing at Oxford, continuing the theme that Kate started to strengthen democratic resilience. So I think the challenge that we've heard quite a lot about is that globally democratic backsliding is putting democracy at risk. And that's the case even in the long-established and affluent democracies, and that's the novelty here. We've witnessed the gradual deterioration of liberal democracy in 3 areas that we've heard about from our speakers: institutional, societal, and international. And this threat to liberal democracy is underpinned really by what is sometimes referred to as a polycrisis. This is the confluence of long-term problems, the enormous inequality, rising economic inequality that we see, climate change, and acute short-term crises, such as the COVID pandemic or the war in Ukraine, that are creating opportunities for autocrats or would-be autocrats to exploit the vulnerabilities of democracy. So that's the challenge. What are we doing about it? We are in the process of building a transformative center for democratic resilience with a world-leading research agenda focused on the domestic and international resilience of liberal democracy in Europe and the global north in my department. So we're one of the largest political science departments in the world. We have 90 academics, 1,200 students. We are also home of the flagship PPE degree in Oxford. And our distinctive approach to research on democratic backsliding and resilience rests on 3 pillars. So the first one is we're seeking to develop an integrated approach to the interlocking institutional, societal, and international dimensions of democratic resilience. We're using cutting-edge methods and research designs to study these problems. And thirdly, we focus on research exactly as Kate does, with practical policy impact. We're really interested in that. So I'll give you an example, and Kate already mentioned that I might say something about the UK. I'll give you an example, and this is the introduction of the voter ID legislation that we've seen in the UK. This is a research project that I'm leading in the department. So just by way of background, in 2022, the UK mandated the introduction of strict photo voter ID in general elections and in English devolved elections. Now, the context here really matters because in the UK, we don't have national ID, unlike many other developed democracies which do have national ID. And a significant number of voters actually lack the requisite ID. The legislation makes the democratic right to vote conditional on your ability to present the right form of ID, and it was first implemented this year in May in the local elections in England. And so the introduction of voter ID, I think, is important to understand as part of a broader international trend. So we've seen across many developed democracies the politicization of democratic rights, including rights to vote. And current debates about introducing or tightening mandatory voter ID are central to this trend and affect over 1 billion voters worldwide, including in the US, of course, but also in the UK, and in India, and in Australia, many different contexts. So what might be the potential consequences of this type of measure? This is kind of exactly the question that Kate was asking earlier. Well, strict photo ID can affect fraud. It can also affect electoral participation, that's turnout, and it may affect how voters perceive elections, whether they perceive them as fair, whether they perceive them as legitimate. So voter ID in the UK was justified by the government as a measure to combat electoral fraud and to increase election integrity and voter confidence in the electoral process. But opposition to voter ID in Parliament and in civil society was highlighting potentially adverse implications. So the fact that voter ID may potentially depress turnout, particularly amongst socioeconomically disadvantaged groups, and in ways that may not be politically neutral. It may reduce confidence in the electoral process. It may reduce perceptions of the fairness of the electoral process. It's an empirical question exactly how this works. And so this is what we ask in our project. We asked, how does voter ID actually affect electoral turnout and voter attitudes? So a little bit of context on the UK here, because it matters. So there is very little evidence of electoral fraud by personation in the UK. The Electoral Commission published a report that essentially says there was one conviction in 2021 for electoral fraud, and all elections that happened in 2021 in the UK. That included local elections, Senate elections, Scottish elections, Police and Crime Commissioner elections, and by-elections. The reform may have some effects on turnout, and the effects that we anticipate on turnout are that it reduces turnout because it increases the costs of going to vote. You need to think about, getting an ID or bringing it. And that may work in two ways. You may either just not attempt to vote, or you may attempt to vote, but you may have forgotten an ID, or you may have the wrong ID and you may be turned away. And so the Electoral Commission focused on the second mechanism and looked at what happened in the May elections and reported that 14,000 voters actually did turn up to vote, attempted to vote, but were turned away because they lacked the right form of photo ID. So that's 0.25% of all those who turned out to vote in the 2023 local elections. It's a lot more than the one person who was convicted for fraud in 2021, but this very much underestimates the impact of the reform. Why is that? Well, it underestimates the impact of the reform because we know that awareness of the voter ID requirement was very, very high before the local elections. If you vote in England, you know that your local authority probably will have run an awareness campaign. The Electoral Commission ran an awareness campaign. People were very aware of the voter ID requirement. So to the extent that this reform had an effect on turnout, it was probably not on people who actually turned up at the polling station and then found they had the wrong form of ID or no ID. It was the people who actually stayed away. And so that's what we are assessing in our study, focusing on self-reported turnout, pre- and post-election, with surveys in all English local authority authorities that held elections in 2022 prior to the reform and this year after the reform. We have 6,000 respondents overall, and this is just very quickly, and this is the only graph I'm going to show you. This is very quickly what we find. So on the left-hand side, can I point? No. Okay, on the left-hand side, you have the survey results pre-election 2022, post-election 2022, and we always see that more people think they're going to vote than actually turn out to vote. Then we have 2023, after the introduction of the reform, pre-election and post-election. And we see that post-election self-reported turnout drops. It drops by about 7%. And then we were interested to see, is there a partisan effect? How does the reform affect Labour-leaning voters and Conservative-leaning voters? And it turns out Labor-leaning voters in red and conservative-leaning voters in blue are affected in exactly the same way. There is no difference between these two groups. Okay, so just coming back to where this project fits in. So these effects, I think it's important to note, are specific to local elections in England. The local electorate is a different electorate from the general electorate. People who turn out in local elections are generally more interested in politics, it's a smaller group, they're better informed typically, so we would expect any turnout effects to be actually larger in a general election. So it's important to make sure that people understand this and that we do what we can to remedy any adverse effects on participation. So that's our aim. Our aim is to minimize the adverse effects on democracy in the UK. Our key partners in the UK, as in other developed democracies that we work with, are the institutions that check and balance government, as well as the civil service itself, in fact, because government isn't entirely unitary. So we're working with the Electoral Commission, we're working with election administrators, we're working with Parliament, and with the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, which is implementing this reform. And I'll be hosting a workshop next week, Friday, to talk to all these people about comparing results of the analyses that we've all respectively been conducting of what happened in the local elections and thinking about how this can be better managed in the next general election. So this project just illustrates one aspect of our work on the resilience of liberal democracies. And just to tie it back to the Center for Democratic Resilience, with that center, what we'll do is kind of do more of this work in developed democracies, trying to shore up the resilience of those democracies, trying to help various institutions that check and balance to shore up the resilience of democracy. Our ambition is to match the complexity of the ongoing challenges with this integrated approach that draws on institutional, societal, and international dimensions of democratic resilience, to use cutting-edge methods, and then to prioritize really politically relevant questions that feed into policy processes. And I leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Before we thank our speakers, I just wanted to make a quick comment related to Ian's first question. I came across a very interesting statistic that I wanted to share before we close. I come from the United States, where we have 50 states, 435 congressional districts, but we also have 3,000 counties, which is the most granular way to look at political behavior. The first presidential election in which I voted was 1980, in which Ronald Reagan defeated the incumbent president, Jimmy Carter. At that time, the percentage of Americans who lived in counties in which one presidential candidate defeated the other by more than 20 points, which is what you would call a landslide county or runaway election. The percentage of Americans who lived in such counties was 25%. Today, it is over 65%. People live in counties in which the outcome of next year's presidential election is already known. So, one-party state. Yes, exactly. So blue states, red states, but it's also granular at the county level. It's partly because of American geographic mobility, but also because of American politicians have created a science out of gerrymandering so that they create safe seats. So I just wanted to point out, this is a very somber way to end the meeting, but it's not just a question of people selecting into Fox News or MSNBC or going into WhatsApp groups or Facebook groups. It's also that people actually have a sort of polarization that is residential, that is a lived sort of segregated polarization. And it is kind of a ratchet effect on American democracy that is going to be very, very difficult to undo. But the one place that's the enemy of echo chambers is the university, and we're grateful that you came back for Meeting Minds weekend, and we hope that you've enjoyed this panel. Please join me in thanking our four speakers.